In 1998, fresh off his award-winning smash hit Good Will Hunting, Gus Van Sant released his remake of the 1960s psychological horror classic Psycho. The box office response was abysmal to say the least, failing to make back its budget during its theatrical run. Though to be fair, this wasn't exactly a shock, considering Van Sant's art house cinema roots. What was surprising was the celebrated critical beating the movie received. Reviews ranged from dispassionate dismissals to merciless, sharp-tongued insult-laden dissections. So what exactly was the difference between Hitchcock's celebrated original and Van Sant's quickly forgotten remake? Well, not much. Rather than altering the direction and cinematography in any meaningful way, Van Sant opted for a shot-for-shot remake, as in duplicating the exact camera angles and editing, only this time with color, blood, and 1998 aesthetics. An interesting idea from a technical standpoint, but as movie critic Philip Worth said in his review, the film is polished where it should be edgy and impersonal where it should be seductive. Video game remakes, successful or otherwise, largely embrace that philosophy, layering on modern sensibilities over celebrated classics in an effort to engage a new audience and rekindle the feeling of the original. This is rarely a simple graphical enhancement, but also includes new systems, controls, locations, and more. However, the newly released Shadow of the Colossus takes the far more dangerous route, polishing visuals, bumping resolutions, and stabilizing frame rates while leaving its 2005 design mostly untouched. But before we examine this latest iteration, let's talk about why this 13-year-old title is still held in such high regard. Back in 2005, the video game industry had been somewhat stagnant for the past decade. Of course, there were still plenty of incredible titles released every month, but for the most part, artistic expression had to balance with commercial potential. After all, this was before the indie boom and console digital storefronts. It wasn't enough that a developer believed in a concept, they would also have to convince a publisher, which is why Sony's first-party studio Team Ico was such a promising sign of things to come. Headed up by CG animator Fumito Ueda, the developer's first project Ico was praised for its tranquil atmosphere and original storytelling. Even to this day, it remains one of the few games where holding hands is a central mechanic. And before Ico was even released, the team was hard at work producing concepts for a follow-up, an online multiplayer experience where players would take down mammoth beasts together, though many of these ideas would be scaled back to a single player due to budget and workforce restrictions, with the end result being the celebrated PlayStation 2 classic, Shadow of the Colossus. Though for the sake of brevity, we'll be taking a look at the PlayStation 4 version. At the time, there wasn't anything else remotely like it. Shadow was moody yet inspired, somber but chaotic. A mysterious boy rides throughout a desolate landscape, slaying enormous creatures in an effort to revive the soul of a loved one. This minimalist creation, as simple as it was, challenged the contemporary industry, which is exactly why it doesn't work in 2018. Now before we go on, I do want to mention this is no fault of the Porthouse developer Bluepoint Games. Simply put, they are the standard for 3D remasters. In fact, they're the same studio that developed the Ico and Shadow collection on the PlayStation 3, and their goal here is to replicate, which they are successful in doing. But as Sony has repeatedly stated, this is a remake, built from the ground up, not a remaster. And yet beyond a handful of new collectibles, a slight adjustment to the user interface, and the previously mentioned visual upgrade, it's identical to the PlayStation 2 version. This is a problem because by today's standards, Shadow is trapped between two different eras. Neither the artistic trailblazing darling it once was, nor the well-aged blockbuster that usually receives this sort of treatment. For example, it's 8 hours long, fairly short by 2005 standards, but in 2018 it feels padded and bloated. The entire experience focuses on riding a horse and following a guiding light until reaching the enormous enemy, climbing it, and killing it. Even now, that's an interesting idea, but looking back, it's obscenely repetitive. These issues start with the large, uninteresting world that the boy travels through. Yes, there's some fruit to collect. Yes, there are lizards to hunt, but beyond this, it can be a bit of a chore to repeatedly start from the exact same temple and travel past the exact same bridges until finally reaching the next Colossus. This is somewhat difficult to convey in a highly edited video like this, considering I'm showing you the best bits back to back, but the environments are usually wide open with tall stone walls. If it's a grassland, it's all grassland. If it's water, it's all water. And if it's sand, it's all sand. In a more ambitious remake, these areas could possibly be transformed into something more abstract and representative, not unlike the original concept art that inspired it. But in this high-definition realistic incarnation, it's just kind of boring. And as awkward as it might be to say, tedium is the best way to describe the Colossi encounters. Sure, they still feature a strong visual design sensibility that's just as striking today as it was back then, but the actual events themselves are really uninspired, either direct and to the point, where players climb the giant giants attack their glowing weak points with arrows and swords while carefully managing their dwindling stamina gauge. Or they take place in a series of obtuse puzzle interactions with completely unnatural solutions. In either attempt, the lumbering giant's defenses are slowly removed. The problem here is the clear and defined stages of execution. The battles that once felt chaotic and desperate are now regimented and stilted. So often the beast's attempts to attack or shake the boy loose are obviously ineffective, killing any real threat or an escalation in tension. Despite the impressive new lighting and textures attempts to distract the audience, it just makes it that much easier to see the strings. Now, it's not all lost. There are still a handful of Colossi that retain their original charm. My personal favorites involve climbing aboard a soaring monster high above the burning desert, or narrowly avoiding a headstrong dog-like creature as he bashes down a series of columns. But sadly, they're towards the back end of the second half, and they're essentially much improved revisions of previous sequences. Altogether, there are 16 Colossi, and frankly, there had to be. During the PlayStation 2 era, games were expected to be bigger. Heck, the best-selling games of 2005 were Pokemon, 2 separate licensed football franchises, and Gran Turismo. Cutting the single-player below 8 hours would have been unacceptable. Just as today its double-digit enemy count betrays its narrow concept, squandering both the story's thematic pacing and mystery. After every victory, the boy is suddenly attacked by an escaping darkness, only to find himself surrounded by a growing number of cloudy ghosts. The first time, it's haunting. The second time, it's foreboding. But by the third time, it's eye-rollingly obvious. We get it. It's foreshadowing. Before eventually concluding with a painfully pretentious and nonsensical ending. But it wasn't always that way. In 2005, Shadow of the Colossus was described as complex and emotionally stirring. Some even said it was one of the best games ever made. How could it be that only 2 generations later, it's an overly long, mechanically dry, embarrassingly self-serious slog? And as depressing as that may sound, it's a promising sign for the future. As I said before, video games were trapped in the traditional roles of developers and publishers seeking a general audience. And it's a testament to how far the industry has come in just 13 years that one of the most artistic and experimental titles now feels like an overly scripted relic. But Shadow's historic significance and initial reception will always be true. And while it can never be directly measured, Team Ico's efforts to push the medium forward were absolutely successful. Unfortunately, this remake can't possibly recapture the feeling or influence of the original, and without any sort of meaningful updates beyond horsepower-driven graphics, it can't match the quality of today's work. Shadow of the Colossus, despite Bluepoint's best efforts, is better remembered than revisited.